December 13, 1937. The gates of Nanjing swung open. The heavy wood creaked against the stone. Inside, the city held its breath. Then came the flash. Thousands of bayonets caught the pale winter sun. Behind the steel stood the 6th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army. What followed was not a battle. It was 6 weeks of systematic erasure. 300,000 civilians and disarmed soldiers. Gone. That is the population of a whole European capital, extinguished in 40 days. Neighborhoods burned to ash. Families with centuries of history were wiped out in a single afternoon. At the head of the column rode Lieutenant General Hisao Tani, 54 years old. He looked at the trembling city with cold pride. He did not know the future. He did not know that 10 years later he would stand on this exact ground in iron chains to face a firing squad. But on this morning, the general simply kicked his horse forward. But the ride didn't last forever. 10 years passed. On April 26, 1947, Hisao Tani returned to Nanjing, not on a white horse, not as a conqueror. He arrived in iron chains. The streets were packed. Thousands of survivors lined the road. They didn't scream in fear this time. They screamed for blood. Tani stood trial before the specific people he tried to erase. The verdict came quickly. A firing squad ended the 54-year-old general on the outskirts of the city. Textbooks usually skip the retribution. They bury the end of the story. That is the purpose of veil history. We dig through the darkest archives. We drag the uncomfortable truth into the light. No politics, no sugarcoating, just the cold, hard facts. But the road to that execution wall began 16 years earlier, on September 18, 1931. Why did the world remain silent? Because the lie was perfect. Manchuria, a region rich in coal and heavy industry. Japanese officers planted dynamite on a section of their own railway. A controlled explosion, just enough noise to create a pretext. They blamed Chinese dissidents immediately. The Imperial Army rolled across the border before the smoke cleared. This was not a skirmish. Within months, Japan seized the entire territory. Manchuria covers an area the size of France and Germany put together. Tokyo called it an incident. They spent the next 6 years pushing deeper. Calculated land grabs, border provocations. They treated the invasion of sovereign land like an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a test of the global order. The League of Nations protested. Diplomats wrote angry letters, but the world simply watched. That imperial machine needed an operator. It found the perfect candidate in Hisao Tani. Born December 22, 1882, Okayama Prefecture. Zoom in on a graduation photo. Stiff collar, serious eyes. The year is 1903. The 15th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. This generation stood at a dangerous intersection. The ancient samurai code on one side, modern industrial warfare on the other. Tani absorbed both. Cut to the mud of World War I, he was there. Then the Army War College. He didn't just serve, he excelled. Gold braids on a dress uniform, heavy medals pinned to the chest. 40 years of flawless service. 4 decades building a reputation as a scholar and a tactician. By 1937, he held the reins of the 6th Division, the Army's elite, disciplined, experienced, lethal. On paper, Lieutenant General Tani was the model officer, educated, respected. That is the horror. He was not a street thug. He was the best the empire had to offer. But in the shadow of Nanjing's walls, the general stepped over the line that separates a soldier from a butcher. General Tani had been sharpening his blade for 40 years. On July 7, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge, he finally got to use it. Night maneuvers outside Beijing. Total darkness. A roll call came up short. One private was missing. That was the only excuse the empire needed. Commanders demanded entry to a local town to search. The Chinese garrison refused. Then the night tore open. Muzzle flashes. Gunfire. The missing soldier was a pretext. The war was a fact. Peace evaporated in seconds. Beijing fell. Then the machine turned toward Shanghai. 3 months of savage street fighting left the city in ruins. But the momentum did not stop. The eyes of the high command locked onto the ultimate prize, Nanjing, the capital, the heart. They calculated that taking the city would end the war in less than 4 weeks. The spark from the Marco Polo Bridge burned all the way to the Yangtze. On December 13, 1937, it consumed the capital. The massive defensive walls were breached, but the command structure collapsed hours before the masonry. Generals didn't rally their men, they ran. Left alone, the garrison didn't fight, it dissolved. Panic moved faster than the enemy. Soldiers tore the insignia off their collars. In damp alleys, men frantically stripped out of their uniforms. Clatter, thud. Rifles and helmets hit the cobblestones. They pulled on stolen civilian robes. They tried to blend in, to vanish. It was useless. Hisao Tani's 6th Division flooded the streets. The first 24 hours redefined the mission. This wasn't a battle anymore. The Japanese troops stepped over the piles of discarded weapons and marched into the city. Darkness swallowed the streets. But in the Western District, a single lamp flickered to life. The man at the desk was a dedicated Nazi. He was also the last line of defense for 250,000 people. John Rabe, representative of Siemens, the company wiring the Third Reich for war. Now, he sat in Nanjing, writing by the light of burning buildings. The glass on his desk rattled with every mortar impact. He wasn't planning logistics, he was documenting hell. Rabe and a handful of foreigners carved out a sanctuary. 3.86 square kilometers, a tiny island of neutrality. Outside the line, death. Inside, a desperate crush of humanity. Rabe patrolled the perimeter. On his arm, the swastika armband. In Europe, a mark of terror. Here, a shield. Japanese officers saw the emblem and hesitated. That hesitation saved lives. But the scale of the massacre broke him. Corpses every 200 meters. Shops looted by roving squads. Rabe believed in the system, so he wrote directly to Adolf Hitler. He begged the Führer to stop the Japanese ally. He asked for reason. He got silence. But he kept writing. Those 1,800 pages lay hidden in a family archive until 1996. But even the Oskar Schindler of China reached his limit. Rabe saved thousands. He could not save them all. 300,000. That is the official Chinese count. It equals the entire population of a city like Pittsburgh. Erased. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was more conservative. They estimated 200,000. But the reality on the street was not mathematical. It was physical. Witnesses found corpses every 100 to 200 meters. A carpet of dead. Even the invaders kept account. The most conservative scholarly estimates, based strictly on Japanese military records, reveal a terrifying baseline for the opening weeks. 46,215. But those digits were not abstract. They were physical bodies piling up on the mud of the Yangtze riverbanks. Was there a safe place? No. Soldiers kicked open the doors of the International Safety Zone. They entered hospitals. They pulled patients from their beds. Historians estimate between 20,000 and 80,000 women were assaulted. The 6th Division, under General Hisao Tani, did not treat this as a battle. They treated it as a disposal operation. The logistics were simple. Soldiers marched columns of Chinese prisoners to the water's edge, hands bound with telephone wire. The river blocked their retreat. Behind them, machine gunners waited for the signal. The heavy Type 92s opened fire. Rows of men fell into the silt. The gray water of the Yangtze turned a thick, dark red. The current carried corpses downstream, but the soldiers worked faster than the river. When the barrels overheated, the method changed. Bullets cost money. Tani's troops used live civilians for bayonet practice instead. A thrust to the chest saved a round for the emperor. Tani didn't just know, he ordered it. The blood on Hisao Tani's hands had dried years ago. The ink on the Capitulation Act was still wet. Authorities came for the general immediately. He was stripped of command and placed in cuffs. The legal ground for his arrest had been laid on September 2, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. The fighting ended. The reckoning began. Tani was extradited to China. The Allies didn't choose a neutral venue. They chose the scene of the crime. The Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal. Early 1947. He stood accused in the very same city his 6th Division had turned into a graveyard. The geography itself was part of the accusation. The judges called the court to order. How do you prove a commander's guilt if he never personally pulled the trigger? The prosecution found the answer in the diaries of his own soldiers. By early 1947, the blood and chaos of the massacre had been sorted into neat bureaucratic stacks. The courtroom became a processing plant for horror. On the prosecutor's table, hundreds of black and white photographs sat in piles. Images of trenches, severed heads. Beside them lay the journals captured from Japanese infantry. Private entries written with chilling casualness. Soldiers described clearing a trench with the same tone as a weather report. But paper was not enough. The court needed voices. Survivors stepped forward. Foreign observers took the stand. Minor Cyril Bates, a professor from the University of Nanjing, testified directly against the general. He described the systematic slaughter he watched from his campus window. He connected the violence on the streets to the orders from the top. The defense crumbled under the weight of these memories. The court moved toward a verdict based on a specific legal concept. This trial cemented the principle that a commander is criminally liable for atrocities he had the power to prevent, yet chose to ignore. While the court analyzed his journals, the author was starving in Berlin. John Rabe saved 250,000 people. That is 10 times the population of the district where he rotted. Yet in 1950, he was dying in poverty. In Nanjing, they called him the living Buddha. In Germany, he faced 2 humiliating denazification trials. He opened his desk drawer. The Nazi armband lay in the dark. Faded red fabric. Dust settled on the swastika. In 1937, this cloth stopped Japanese bayonets. Now it was just a relic in a cold room. But the mail arrived. A heavy box with Chinese stamps. He cut the twine. The citizens of Nanjing sent him food. Unlike Rabe, General Hisao Tani experienced neither poverty nor conscience. He stood in the dock and denied reality. His defense was a shrug. He claimed ignorance. He blamed rogue soldiers. He argued that the mountains of corpses were an exaggeration. The tribunal rejected the lie. The violence lasted 6 weeks. That is 1,000 hours of continuous industrial-scale murder. Tani claimed he didn't notice, but his officers stood at the edge of the pits. Reports moved up the chain of command every day. He never issued a single order to halt. The court delivered the death sentence on February 6, 1947. The paper verdict from February 6 turned into physical reality in spring. On April 26, 1947, a driver named Tang climbed into the cab of a prison truck. He usually hauled mail. Today his cargo was the butcher of Nanjing. Tang gripped the wheel. The truck vibrated against his palms. Through the dusty windshield, he saw the streets of Nanjing choking with people. They weren't there to mourn, they were there to watch. The noise hit the glass like a physical wave. Thousands of voices, one word, revenge. Hisao Tani sat in the back. He was 64 years old. Most of the people he slaughtered in these streets never made it to 30. The convoy reached the Yuhuatai execution grounds. The engine cut. The roar of the crowd dropped to a low, vibrating hum. Tani stepped down into the dirt. He didn't look at the ground. He didn't look at the weeping relatives of his victims. He looked past them. He stood before the firing squad the same way he had commanded his troops, chin up, shoulders back, refusing to admit a single error. The soldier raised the rifle. The bolt clicked. For a second, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Then came the recoil. One shot cracked the air. Tani collapsed forward. The crowd let out a single, collective exhale. The man who entered Nanjing as a god died in the dirt of the same city. Tani faced the wall. But dozens of other commanders turned their backs on the verdict. They bought tickets to South America. While the firing squad did its job in Nanjing, the architects of the slaughter found sanctuary across the ocean. They hid behind false names and diplomatic immunity. The single bullet that killed Tani proved the crime, but it could not resurrect the dead. It simply forced the world to look at the evidence, to listen to the survivors, to record the truth before the perpetrators faded into the jungle. That record is now carved in stone. December 13th, the National Day of Mourning. Every year, sirens wail across the city. The State Memorial stands in Nanjing today, heavy and gray. It is not just a museum. The structure rests directly on top of a mass grave of 10,000. Real bones lie beneath the visitors' feet, but the earth is not settled. This diplomatic scar would continue to bleed 80 years after the shot that killed Tani.
The history remains a battlefield. Nationalist politicians in Tokyo minimize the death toll. They question the photos. They stand at podiums and deny the massacre ever happened.
Every December 13th, the sirens howl across the city. But politics tries to drown them out. It tries to turn the massacre into a dry footnote. A single line in a school textbook that students skim past to get to the next chapter. Don't let them flip the page. 300,000 faces stand behind one verdict. These were not statistics. They were families who trusted the walls to protect them. Hisao Tani extinguished those futures in just 6 weeks. He faced the firing squad because witnesses refused to let the truth rot in the dirt. Now that burden shifts to you. Silence is the only way the killers win again. Share this story. Force the algorithm to remember what the politicians want to forget. We don't look away.